All right, well, let's kick it off. Hey, everybody, welcome to the Full Quadrant podcast. Hey, Mike, how's it going?
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. What's new?
I did a Holter test for my Dolby.
Oh, really? How'd that turn out?
Came out perfect. Nothing.
Ripley?
Yeah, no issues. So
Nice. Glad to hear it. Awesome. Yeah, things have been great here. We're cooling down. Looking forward to this next episode. I know it's been a little bit of a gap. Everyone's busy and we try not to put out content unless we feel that it's going to be useful and educational. And it's nice to have a little bit of a break, create the hunger paying to want to listen. I had a few people reach out asking about, next episodes and so anyways, we're happy to be here having another recorded conversation. So tell me your thoughts, Mike. We wanted to talk about a little bit of a branch off of our episode of the active dog. It's something that's really it's an important and necessary aspect to training a dog in the NePoPo way, or in any aspect of modern dog training where really the dog it's their idea, the behavior is their idea to take part in that. So we're going to be talking about ignition and the ins and outs of ignition, what it is, what it isn't, how to develop it, the uses and misuses of or misapplications of how people think they're building an ignition might not necessarily be actually building an ignition. So why don't you kick us off, Mike?
I have no idea. Just- no, but I mean, ignition, we always talk about ignition, right, in the school. And part of the homework for Silver School is reading um, the talent code, right? And it talks about ignition in there. And the thing with ignition, why you know, they say, and Bart and Michael always say, water must be boiling, right? That's the ignition they're talking about. The desire must come out of the dog, or if you're teaching people, it must come out of the person, out of the
Right.
people that you're teaching. And ignition has to be, in some dogs, has to be built, right? Because they don't just come out and want to train.
Right. So, for example, going back to the pot of boiling water analogy, would you say that ignition is the temperature of the water and not the water itself?
It's not the temperature it is kind of the temperature, but what it is uh because in boiling water, like the whole analogy is making spaghetti, right? Cooking spaghetti. You cannot start to cook spaghetti, and that's the key, the start. You cannot start to cook spaghetti until the water is at a certain temperature. But it's that the it has to be at a point that work will be successful, right? So the analogy there, where the work is the spaghetti starting to cook.
It's, I mean, the way I'm thinking about it is ignition is the force that drives the outcome, right? The outcome doesn't matter. The outcome is, we're agnostic about the outcome. It's what causes an outcome, right? It causes the noodles to become boiled and malleable. It causes the dog to start moving in a direction of finding a behavior, right? That it's the force behind the action.
Again, I'm going to go back to desire, right? It's that the being, the dog, the person, they are at a point where they want to learn and take in what you're teaching. You know, if you're in a classroom and the let's go to people, the person there is not doesn't want to learn. Doesn't matter how much you talk, how much stuff you show. It doesn't matter. If they don't want to learn, they're not going to take anything from that.
So in the example, the teacher says, "What do you want to learn today?" And the students say, "I don't know." No
Yeah,
ignition, therefore no learning is likely to take place.
yeah. Well, I think it's a little bit different with people too. But ignition is And yeah, you can say it's the student wants to learn a specific topic, but it doesn't have to be where the student has in mind what they want to learn. It could be that
That's
they
what I'm
want to
saying. Yeah, that's why I'm saying the
learn
outcome doesn't
whatever you
matter.
have to teach.
That's why, yeah, exactly. That's why I said previously the outcome, it's irrelevant what the outcome is. It's just that there's a force that wants to make something happen. What that thing is that happens is not important as much as just they want something to take place.
Yeah. And it's and with the desire coming out of the dog or the person, if we talk about a person, a student wanting to learn, it's that they will that if they have ignition, they will seek out the teacher to try to learn. It's not that the teacher has to go to them to say, hey, I want to teach you something,
Right.
right? And the same thing with the dog. If you come out on the training field or training area, if the dog has ignition, they're going to seek out the trainer to try to learn something, right? To try to see what the trainer has to offer. Whereas if the dog doesn't have ignition, they're just going to come out and just start doing whatever they want,
Right.
right? Just exploring and not focused on anything, right?
I would, yeah. And moving in this direction, I think that ignition is not satisfied until something happens, right? So, like your example of the dog that goes out and is satisfied to sniff, right? That dog might have low level ignition, but like a dog with extreme ignition might not be satisfied with the activity of just sniffing if there's nothing else going on, right? He's going to try to make something more exciting happen, right? He's going to try to make you do something as a result. And then we walk into the paradigm of, active dog, reactive handler, right? And we're not looking to rehash our episode on active dog. Which is a really nice and established episode in and of itself. But a lot of times the understanding about ignition is not fully comprehended by most, right?
Yeah.
So with
Yeah.
ignition,
What
then how do you build it? If it's not present, how do you build that?
well, one issue sometimes is that the dog has is not in need of anything. The dog has a
No
bowl of
problems
food
to
on the
solve.
floor. Yes. And one is that there's always food on the floor. So there's no reason to go hunt for food, you know. There's always toys on the floor, so there's no reason to go hunt for a toy.
Or the dog always has freedom, so there's no reason to expend energy because he
It
has no buildup of energy, no energy
yeah,
reserves.
yeah, there's no desire to do anything to obtain those things. So there's that's where the ignition is not there, right? There's no fire burning in that dog. So it comes out, you have food in your hand, it comes and looks at you and he's like, I'm gonna when I go home, there's a whole bowl of food waiting for me.
Mm-hmm.
You come out, you have a toy in your hand, a ball, a tug, whatever. It looks at you, it's like, I got 20 tugs at home sitting around the house, you know. So there's no desire for the dog to do anything, other than there's desire, but it's just I'm just gonna just go around and do whatever I want.
Here's another thing for the concrete thinkers out there in our viewers or listeners, people that really need examples to kind of cling to help them kind of grasp this concept. I would say ignition is kind of like torque, right? It's not horsepower. Horsepower goes up and down, but torque is what powers through an object, right? Like, it's that diesel power that gets you the towing capacity or the ability to push through an obstacle. For example, horsepower, you can have a lot of horsepower, but with low torque, you might not push through a wall. But if you've got low horsepower but high torque, you can break through that same wall that the other vehicle couldn't. And I think that ignition, one way to spot a dog with ignition or without, to identify what level of ignition the dog has, is to look at the satiation in the dog. Maybe you throw the ball once, and then the dog just takes the ball, or maybe runs up to it, enjoyed the chase, but sniffs it and then walks away to go find something else. You know, that to me is an indication of maybe a lower ignition dog, or maybe a dog that needs work building that ignition. But it shows you the current level, right? It shows you that the ignition at that moment, whether genetic or something that needs to be worked on and built, is not present enough to use a ball as a motivator for work, right?
Yeah, and well, for us, for dog training, ignition has to do with the dog's desire to interact with you,
Sure.
right? Because it's dog training, so we're trying to teach something.
Yeah.
And that's
But
the
that's
whole
the
thing is that, some people would say engagement, maybe, but I think it's a little bit different in that um it's that the difference with engagement and ignition. Engagement is, a lot of people think they have ignition, but what they have is just engagement, where they activate the dog, right? They come out, and while they're doing something, the dog will engage with them. Whereas ignition
right.
is the dog is pushing the person to try to get them to do something.
Yes,
Like,
yeah, that's the correct definition. For me, there really isn't, I mean, engagement is such a buzzword amongst dog trainers and dog owners. It's a very positive only reference, because if you think about it, you don't get engagement unless you have motivation, right? You won't have a dog engage with you whatsoever without some without them seeing behind you something that motivates them, right? Whether
is
what
ignition and motivation the same thing then? Or
I think there's a little hybrid. I think there's some shared components, but I think ignition is more intrinsic, where they may not know what it is that is causing them to be ignited or to demonstrate ignition, versus motivation. There's a more of a specific end in mind. I'm food
yeah,
motivated, or I'm toy motivated, and that's driving me. It's tapping in.
that's that's exactly what I was thinking. Exactly. Right.
But for me, ignition is more just open-ended, restless drive, right?
Yeah, it's I want to do something, but it's not necessarily specific.
And they don't necessarily have the answer on how they solve it. They're hoping someone else finds that missing puzzle piece and fits it in, and then it makes them satiated.
Yeah. So is building ignition, right? Is it just coming out and feeding your dog?
Oh no. I mean, you can add ignition through that, but I mean that's a very myopic and very narrow approach to utilizing ignition. Ignition can be strengthened from a lot of different drives. And I think it should be, if you want ultimate ignition. I think you should leverage as many areas of motivation as you can. But it's not just leveraging certain areas of motivation like food drive, toy drive, freedom drive, play drive, whatever, right? It's more about, and this is kind of like the conversation on pressure, right? It's like training with pressure is not about putting pressure on, it's in taking it off. That's where the value of using pressure in training is not as much where you put it on, but as where you take it off, right? And I think in ignition training, it's not as much as like, it's kind of like that in the sense that, like, it's not that you go through exercises that build ignition, but it's how you leave the dog so that the next session they start with the same level of ignition that you end on or more, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the amount of ignition you have, right? That the dog has
Mhm.
dictates how much you can work, you
Yeah.
know. And the thing is with the food, and that's how you can tell does your dog have ignition, um, is that even if they're satiated with that, say the food, they want to keep doing something,
Right.
right? Whereas a dog with low or no ignition will work until they're full and then they're like done, like they don't want to
Yes.
work anymore,
Right.
right? So that's a difference between having a dog with ignition and having one with low or no ignition.
Right.
Is that again the desire to work?
Exactly. Whether that drive is satiated or not, they still want to continue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
Exactly. I think that's the real definition. The way people should look at it is defining ignition based off of what's present once a drive has been satisfied.
yes, if you think of it like a battery, right? Of ignition being a battery that's full. What the difference is this: a dog with ignition, the battery is continuously recharging,
Yeah.
right? Whereas a dog without ignition, the battery is depleting as it
It's
goes
just
along.
draining. Yeah. And then it takes
Draining.
extra time. It takes a full cycle before it can replenish to full.
Yep. Yeah. Uh, so do you want to have a dog that, I mean, so then if you have a dog that is full of ignition, right? It's where you want it. What the thing is there, I think the downfall is not downfall as far as training goes, but you might want to put that on a like a cue, right? We start training to like I think they talk about who was it? Like Jay Jack talks about windows of opportunity, right? If you have a dog with high ignition, depending on what you're doing, you might want to put it a window of opportunity there. So telling them like this is now you can express your that ignition, right? You can let it out.
Isn't
Or else you have a dog that's always that happened with me with my Doberman. She was just always, no matter what, she's always looking like, what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? It didn't matter where we're at. You know, there was never it's like it's like uh turning her on or off, right? With a key. There was no on off switch. It was always on.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
never
I
yeah, I never
mean,
installed that off switch with her.
and some dogs it's really hard to. Some dogs they're not inclined to you can't fit a off switch into their breaker board. They're to their circuit board. They don't have room for an off switch, right? They just because they constantly always want to be on.
Yeah.
I mean, my the dog I lost a year ago to osteosarcoma in his rear leg at 3.5 years old, man, like that dog ruined me for all other dogs to come because he had a switch and he was happy to be a throw pillow in the house, but then the minute an opportunity presented itself that I wanted to do something, I had full access to, 100% battery. And that battery, like you said, didn't deplete. And it was just so like I'm sitting, and where I'm actually approaching year his year mark from his passing on the 7th actually. But yeah, man, that dog was special. Like talking about dogs with ignition, the way you want to live with them, because like when you can't find that way to live with the dog, if they're always like putting a ball in your face in the middle of the night, they come to you, shove a ball in your face, shove a ball in your face. You're like, I need to rest, right? Like I don't have your same level of energy, So that's what everyone wants though. And man, it definitely, I feel lucky to have experienced that, but I don't expect to find that again in a dog anytime soon, at least. Um, but
Yeah.
yeah, like ignition, such an interesting
So
thing.
So if you don't have the dog that has the natural off switch, right, that could be one of the things you have to keep in mind when you're building ignition.
Don't build too much.
You either, yeah, depending on, yeah, of course, you have to look at the dog. But with some dogs, they already have ignition. So instead of building ignition, you're going to be building the off switch,
Yes,
right?
because that
Whereas the
takes
dogs that,
discipline.
yes,
So the opposite of ignition is essentially discipline, right? Discipline to contain yourself.
yeah, yeah, perfect.
Discipline to be patient, to wait for the window of opportunity so that you can express the ignition in a way that's not going to get you reprimanded by your owners.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of the pet people run into problems is that they actually have dogs with high ignition naturally,
Mm-hmm.
right? The desire is already there. And either they built it by accident or it was already there and they don't know how to control that,
Right.
you know.
Which happens to a lot of pet owners because a lot of pet people are adopting dogs from shelters. And these are dogs that were purchased as puppies that ended up growing into dogs that had too high level of ignition and no discipline, no containment system on the dog. And it didn't fit into their lifestyle or their living situation. And so now the dog is being passed around from home to home, or it finds its way into a shelter. And then you adopt the dog based off of what you see in the shelter, which may or may not be a true statement. They put these cute pictures out there and they're just trying to get the dogs out of their kennels and their cages. So you end up with a dog with immense amounts of ignition and drive, and now you're stuck with now you're in the same situation the previous owner was in.
Yes. And then also with those dogs, sometimes it takes a while for everything to come out. Actually, it's not just that it takes a while, but there's with the new owner, the dogs that are smart and they're learning what they can get away with, it will accelerate their disobedience because they keep, a lot of people they just let their dogs run free. They get the rescue, and then the dog has all these little successes every day, and they're getting bolder and bolder and bolder until the point where they can't handle them anymore.
Right.
I have a dog that the dog stole the owner's cell phone and took it outside and buried it.
Oh, geez.
So the owner didn't know where it was at. So the owner had to do the Find My iPhone and was going around on the ground with the ear to the ground, trying to hear and feel the vibration of the phone under the ground. Finally found it. It was like 3 inches under dirt.
Wow.
Like they even covered it up. The dog had covered it up. For me, that's a good dog. It shows some ignition there, right?
That's a highly intelligent dog, right? Because that phone is not lost to the dog.
Oh yeah, he'll bring it back a month later.
That dog knows exactly where he buried that treasure. So,
It was funny actually because it was kind of like at night. It was darker, so the owner got a flashlight,
oh man.
was looking around, couldn't find it, put the flashlight down, had to go do something, and then came back, but the dog stole the flashlight in the meantime. So then didn't have the flashlight either.
Sounds like the dog owners got a lot of things they gotta juggle. They're juggling a lot right now. It sounds like their hands are full and not with
Yeah.
their dog. Awesome. No, so let's get back to the situation because I'm sure the listeners are really itching to hear about maybe they've got a dog they'd like to see, or maybe squeeze as much ignition out of the dog as possible. Like what are some things you do specifically to make sure that you set your dog up for increasing ignition?
I always think again, going back, the first thing that comes to mind is always is the desire coming out of the dog. So I come out and I let the dog push me. And it kind of goes back to, the active dog, reactive handler. But that's how you need to build that ignition with the dog wanting to activate you, again, the desire to do something. But the thing that you don't want to do in the beginning is do too many reps because the desire isn't fully there yet.
Right.
You can't do reps unless there's ignition, unless there's desire. So in the beginning, it's very little. Okay. It might be just um the dog doing something with you, or even looking at you, coming up and nudging, whatever it is, whatever you see as the dog showing like initiative, and then rewarding that heavily.
That's such a hard thing because it's so much easier said than done because, right? Like maybe you spend a full day at work and you come home from the office and you're finally excited to see your dog, their tails wagging. They're like, yeah, I know it's either my time for a walk or we get a walk to the park and play some chase and catch or some fetch or some chuck it. And for you, it's a huge stress relief. It's a way you wind down and all of that. And you get out there and your dog's not showing you the thing. And you just want to, like, I just want to go into the motions. You start throwing the ball just because it's for you and not for the dog. Right. That's not building ignition. Right. And the hardest part is the actual human component. It's the discipline required on the human side of the leash that says, oh, my dog isn't pushing for me to do anything. I just need to either stay my hand and not throw the ball, or we just go back to the house, or we not even leave the house at all, right? That's
Yeah.
the hard part, because if your goal is to build ignition, because you have maybe a limited window of opportunity for yourself, not for the dog, but for yourself, where it's like, okay, I've got from 5:30 to 6 p.m. where I've got time for my dog. And then after that, it's got to be back home, family, work, other obligations, whatever it is. And so to translate what you're saying is to be successful in building ignition, you have to do it when the dog is showing that the dog is ready, not when the human is ready. And if you take those sessions based on the dog's readiness, you will see faster results and better results long term than you would if you do it and try to force it into your time frame.
Yeah, it seems slower at the beginning, but it's it's not you pushing the dog, which is what happens most of the time. People that come, we come out and we try to push the dog, push the dog, push the dog. But going back to that, like you're talking about playing ball with a dog, right? Building ignition with that dog might be as simple as that, taking the ball and just put it in your pocket.
Yes.
And then when you see the desire of the dog and they're like, hey, where's the ball?
Why hasn't it come out yet?
Then you produce the ball and you can start playing again. So
Yeah.
that little thing puts another, more power into that
And
ignition.
exactly. And just to be more clear, because I see a lot of a lack of clarity with people on building ignition, or they call it engagement exercises, whatever. Really, you don't have engagement without ignition. That's something I learned from Bart and Michael. And so let your dog tell you when he wants it. And because everyone brings the ball, hey, do you want to, hey, let's go play some ball. Do you want to go? Do you want to play fetch? Do you want to, are you ready to play? Everyone's like trying to pump their dog up with their words. Like you said, just put it in your pocket or don't even get it at all and wait for your dog to start screaming, or like they start vocalizing. And then you're like, oh, now you want something to happen. Then you go over there, produce the ball or the toy or the food. And then as a result, they learn, hey, when I get active, when I get increased in energy, things happen. Active dog, reactive environment.
One other thing is not always rewarding your dog. You don't have to finish always with a reward, you know. to build it. If you want to build ignition, sometimes you just have to say you're playing ball, for example, and the the ball comes, you put on the leash and you still have the ball, maybe you throw it another time, then you grab the leash and drop the ball and then pull the dog back into the house or back to the car,
Away from a
whatever.
ball that you just tossed. So the drive is high.
Right.
Yep.
And it was actually Bart said a story, I think the first silver school. I can't remember when, but he talked about watching his daughter, because his daughter uh Ines would raise the puppies. If he had a puppy, she would raise him, right? And she said Ines was out there with the puppy and she was throwing a toy or whatever it was for the for the dog. And actually he said she was playing guitar or something. She was strumming the guitar, the dog would come, she'd pick up the ball, throw it,
Right.
right? She didn't even care about the dog,
Right.
about playing ball with the dog. It was just the dog was showing ignition. It was like, hey, bringing the ball and pushing it, let's play. She was throwing the toy, whatever it was. And at some point, the toy got stuck in a tree, and the dog was there under the tree, like looking at the toy. And then she had enough, and she just grabbed the dog and just pulled it back in the house. The dog's fighting to get back to that tree.
Right. I remember this story.
And she said, next time when he came out, brought the dog out, the dog ran right to that tree, and he's like, "Okay, let's get the toy now." And that's that form of ignition where the desire is there for the dog. The desire, like, I want to keep doing this. You know, and like you said, that's where talking about all our terms, the chicky chicky chaka. If you have to go out and every single time you have to activate your dog, then the ignition is not there. And there's a difference between having a cue, letting your dog know, okay, now you can express
Right.
yourself,
Right.
and having to activate your dog in some way, or else it won't work. That's the difference, in ignition and just chicky chicky chaka.
Yes, because in the one, the dog is containing his or herself versus there's no containment necessary because there's just no energy. There's no inertia hanging around in that dog's body that's going to cause it to be an active dog, right? So that's
yeah,
the
because
difference.
yeah, the other way, as soon as you stop showing any energy, then the dog stops. Whereas if the dog has ignition, you can just sit there and the dog still is going to have energy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you have to keep pushing your dog to do stuff, then it's not true ignition. It might look like it, but it's not coming out of the dog. Like the
Right.
dog doesn't want to do it unless you tell it. It's almost like you have to tell it has to do it.
Right.
You know,
Um, so what do you do when you see that it might not be ignition the way you hope it's ignition in the dog? What do you do then?
like, what do you mean?
Like maybe you come to the realization that your dog doesn't have the level of ignition that you want. Are there things that you can do? Is it just give it more time? Do you accept the dog for what it is? And what's your play?
Well, I think with some dogs, yeah, there is a ceiling, right? A cap. I don't think every dog you can make it to have. Well, I think what happens is this: the dog has ignition, but it doesn't have the ignition you want,
Right. Yes, that's
or
what I'm
that
asking about.
or that you need for whatever you're trying
Purpose.
to do.
Yeah, the goals that you have for the dog. When you find the mismatch, what are you doing?
So that, I mean, that's up. It's up to you what you do with those dog. With those dogs. Some people, they sell the dog and go get another one. Some people will, if it was a sport dog, they keep it as a pet and then go get another dog to do the sport with. Of course, if it's like, say, a police dog, then it's going to be washed, from the program. But
Right.
also, you can't get a dog that, genetically is not going to have that capability
Right.
or the desire to do a certain thing, you know, because no matter how you try to build it, the desire, you won't be able to build the desire to where you want it.
Right. So, kind of a little bit of a conversation about genetics and just the nature of the dog, right? Some dogs are limited by just how they were formed and, what genes are expressed in their dog. Um, so
So you can bring out the desire of a dog that genetically has that capability,
oh,
but
yes, my question was that I was getting to is where do you typically expect to see a full expression of a drive in ignition in the dog? Like, is it 6 months, 12 months? Do you wait beyond 12 months to 18 months? Or like when do you know you're seeing the dog that he like maybe he may not have the fully matured level of drive, but you can see that he's got intensity in his ignition and you can forecast that and extrapolate that to see the trajectory it's going to take. Where do you expect to make an accurate assessment on that dog? Are you looking at 6 months, 12 months, younger, older?
I don't think it's the age, but I think is it if you if you are seeing a constant improvement, right? If you're seeing a constant improvement, I think that's where you could say, okay, we're still moving in the right direction. But so age, it's not about age necessarily, but because if you see the dog and it's not improving in what you want, if it's not, if that ignition isn't growing, if it isn't getting more and more, and it's not at the level you want, then you might have to say it's possible it's not going to be there. But also you can stop. One thing you can do is stop training because it could be where you're overtraining,
Sure.
right? So you can stop training for a while and then come back and see where you're at.
But with a dog with, and this is the way I see it, right? So personal opinion, disclaimer here. A lot of people will do fancy training or specific routines, right? Rituals, call them, to make sure that they facilitate the most amount of ignition in their dog. But truly, a dog that's got the quality of ignition that I like and that a lot of sports people like, you know, to carry them through, they just want that present, regardless of the ritual, right? Maybe as a puppy, right? Yeah, you're going to do some drive building exercises, wait for the dog to activate you, and then in turn that into the game or the walk or the ball session or the food session. Um, but in a dog with true level, robust ignition, you're going to know that that is present at any, whether he's in the house or he's outside the house. You'll know, you'll have reason to believe that that's there, right? There'll be
Yeah,
less push and shove than there will be
yeah,
otherwise.
yeah. You should see it, you know, pretty quickly. But and also, I think that question goes to more of, I think someone that has tried to start training before they had the
Ignition,
ignition.
right?
You know, if you start training before you have ignition, then that's where you're trying to say, well, when is your this going to kick in?
Right.
I think that, and like you said, when you have good genetics and everything, you'll get it pretty quickly.
You'll know. You won't be asking the
But
questions of, does my dog have ignition?
but
You'll know
quickly
if
in
yeah,
yeah,
the dog tells
but
you.
quickly doesn't mean like in a week
Sure.
necessarily. You know, it's after you do have to wait until the dog is ready. Um, like it has to show you that it wants to work. That's the whole thing. You know,
Yep.
does the dog want to do it, as
So
opposed
on
to
the other hand,
you want it to do it?
right. So we've talked a lot about building ignition, identifying ignition. What happens when you've got the ignition and you need to temper it or keep it in levels of moderation? What are some things that you like to do to help make sure you facilitate balance with that dog? And
I think we kind of talked about that is kind of having a cue to tell the dog when it can start expressing that. Um, but it's also doing, if I understand you correctly, it's also doing other things with the dog rather than just training.
helping the dog
And
find enjoyment in other areas other than expressing explosive ignition, right?
well, it's showing them that when they're with you, that doesn't mean that you're always having to go 100 miles an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Because it has to do with you, the presence with you. So if you're with me, it's not always let's go, let's go, let's go. There are times when we just hang out,
Right.
you know. If not, then yes, you will become a cue. Your presence is always doing, always going. Which if you want that, that's fine. You just have to know that's what you're doing. So every time you bring it out of the crate, you don't just start doing stuff. Sometimes you bring it out of the crate and just hang out,
Right.
if that's what you want. If the dog is only going to be a working dog, for example, and if it's going to be in a kennel or working, then you don't necessarily have to do that. But if you want the balance, yeah, you have to show different times that we don't express everything we have, our energy. We just hang out on the couch or on the floor, or we just go for, a normal walk. That's how you're going to balance that.
Gotcha. Yeah. No, good. No, I mean, I think just to recap, in dealing with ignition and trying to capitalize on moments and windows of opportunity, as you call them, the key is to avoid trying to force your dog into doing the thing you want it to do and just allow the natural process for the dog to come out. Let him decide that he wants to be active, that he decides, like, maybe when it's time, maybe he starts running, doing the zoomies around the living room or something. Then you're like, oh, he really wants to be active. Let's go outside. Right. Or if he's jumping on you and like trying to interact with you, now he's saying, hey, let's do something together. Right. And now you go outside or now you go train, which
Yeah.
which can be very disruptive in a routine lifestyle, right? Like you never know when those moments where your puppy or your dog might jump on you and say, hey, I want to do something. But if you ignore that opportunity of your dog telling you, he's like, hey, I'm ready, and you don't reward that, then he learns that that isn't how he gets things in his life, and you miss that opportunity. So it can be disruptive to your lifestyle or your calendar schedule, your routine. You have to play it by ear. That's the hard part about building ignition, is that it never comes, the opportunity never presents itself when it's most convenient for you. It's always, because again, going back to it, it has to be when it's ready with the dog, or when the dog, it's when it's right for the dog.
Yeah. And that's what I think we mentioned that not in this, not while we were talking now, but where there's a difference between the a dog that is active and a dog that has ignition,
Mm-hmm.
right? The dog that is active is just expressing energy, where the dog that has ignition wants to do something,
He wants there to be a
right?
constructive end, not just like
Yeah.
random dopamine or adrenaline dumps.
Yeah. It
He
wants
wants
to
the
learn, it wants
constructive
to
thing.
work,
Mm.
it wants to interact rather than just I'm gonna run for an hour.
Looking for meaning. He wants meaningful activity,
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
right? Not meaningless activities or open-ended activities. He wants to see, he wants constructive, he wants to be working towards a specific outcome.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's good.
Good.
On a personal note, do you have any stories of you kind of alluded to one of your Dobermans, but I don't know if do you have a funny story or example of a dog that was super high with ignition, something funny they did, or something that like, is a kind of an endearing memory?
An example of ignition. Um, you put me on the spot a little bit.
Take your time. We can edit.
The first thing that really comes to mind is con, and it's kind of a combination of ignition and desire for something, right? Being pushy is when if he sees the dopamine box turned upside down, that he goes and he like tips it over so he can put his head in it. But that's an example of the desire coming out of the dog, right? It's
Yeah.
the dog who is pushing, trying to get something to happen instead of you going and turning the box over and then him puts his head in there. He is really pushy. He's got a lot of ignition.
Awesome. Well, that's great. Entering the end of the year, it's crazy to think there's like what, 60 days, less than 60 days now till the end of the year. We have a gold school coming up in the first week of March in Vegas. So excited about that.
March 3rd.
March 3rd. Yeah, looking forward to that. That's going to be a lot of fun. Oh, I was just going to say, if you're interested in the gold school, the NePoPo online silver school is available. And you can graduate that, and then you can sign up for gold school with us. And that's one way to get out and get involved and, go through the system. And if you have questions, reach out to us on the podcast links, the social media pages. We're happy to provide feedback, guidance, questions as you're kind of going through that process.
Yeah, always. And of course, if you like the podcast, it's the best way to do it is not to say you like it or to click like or whatever, but it's either to make a comment on one of the episodes, or even better than that is just to share it, you know, somewhere. Share it on social media, Facebook, uh, only if you like it. But also, if you don't like what we're saying and you want to show your friends how bad we are, you should share it with them too, right? Or comment and tell us how bad we are. Yeah. Either way, we just want feedback or
Yeah.
and help getting it out there.
Yeah. It's great. Is Con right there in the back in your kennel behind you?
Yeah. Sometimes he'll start putting his paw through the kennel, like if he wants something.
He wants to be on camera, man.
He
Bring him
wants to
out.
be on camera.
Bring him out. Let him come out and say hi to the viewers.
Come here, buddy.
He was probably snoozing. He's like, these guys are so boring. They just drone on and on about.
Come here. Come on. Come on. Come on.
Hey, Con.
He was snoozing.
Hey, hey, buddy.
Say his name.
Con. Hey, right here. Well, awesome. Good stuff, man. Another good one. Good chat. Good conversation.
Yeah, it was good.
Con, do you have anything you want to add to it?
What is it? I don't know if he can. No, he can hear you.
All right. Well, good stuff, man. Good talking with you. Thanks for tuning in to episode 15. This is episode 15 of the Full Quadrant podcast. Stay tuned.
Yep. See you guys. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.